Hello everybody, welcome to the Talent Equation. I would say the Talent Equation podcast, but actually I'm going to call this one a carcast because I am currently driving on my way from the home of English golf, Woodall Spa, and just had an interesting meeting with some old colleagues actually from the world of golf, discussing some of their needs from a coaching and a workforce and a talent development perspective. So we were working across the whole sport, looking at what they were doing, which was great because I've been there for a long time, and it was really nice to reconnect with some old colleagues and some good friends. Anyway. My reason for doing this podcast is because it's been a long time since I've done a kind of one-to-one, and there's been quite a lot of things happening, a lot of things going on, and I wanted to share with you some of the thinking and some of the ideas and some of the things that I've been considering, some of the questions that I've been posed, and the challenges that people are facing, and just exploring some of that with you and various things that are going on. So I think the starting point is I just wanted to share with you an interesting idea that has been percolating in my mind around the ways in which we consider coaching from the perspective of human interaction, and particularly around this idea of perception, awareness, and consciousness. What stimulated the thinking is I'm an enormous fan of the Sam Harris podcast called Waking Up. Sam has got an enormous following in America, and he covers a very wide range of topics. He'll do stuff on politics and discuss some of the challenges of Trump. He discusses the challenges of left-wing or ultra-left-wing liberal ideology and how that is creating the rise of right-wing identity politics, which brings us to things like Brexit and the rise of Trump and increased very difficult scenarios around things like race and gender and all those sorts of things, which are seen as a potential backlash against ultra PC liberal left ideologies. He covers neuroscience, he covers philosophy, he covers artificial intelligence, he covers the nature of consciousness. He discusses things like free will and whether there is such a thing as free will. Anyway, there's a whole range of areas, but his most recent podcast was with a neuroscientist or neurophilosopher called Anil Seth, and Anil Seth is from the University of Sussex and has done a TED talk on the nature of consciousness. And in this podcast they discuss interesting thoughts around how we as humans interact with the world, and some of the theories around the way in which humans are engaged in the way they sort of make sense of the world. And I just wanted to share with you some thoughts that stimulated during the podcast. Anil talks about really clear and very extremely interesting, difficult concepts to grasp, but I've got to admit I'm still wrestling with a few of them. But one of them he talks about was around how human beings, when they are perceiving the world around them, they don't actually just perceive objects. What they do is they make approximations around what is happening or what is likely to happen based on previous experiences. So the way human beings are perceiving actions, or perceiving other human beings, or perceiving the way they would engage in interacting with another human being, or engaging with an object, or engaging with a set of other parameters in a different environment, is based around a series of inferences around what is likely to happen. So it's essentially making almost like judgments around the likely outcomes of certain actions. And the way in which we do that, so the way our brains are making sense of the world, is by essentially continuously, on an ongoing basis, prejudging these external environmental stimuli, and fitting them together to create a coherent picture or a story of what's happening, what's going to happen, what's happening. And when our brains are doing this, what we are then doing it, and the way we do that, the way we make those inferences, the way we create those judgments, is based on either our previous experiences, or it's based on some relevant or some element of experience that's we have previously encountered in other aspects of our life, and that those previous experiences are then sort of mapped onto this experience to create essentially like a motor pattern, or a plan which helps us to then I guess devise a solution, or to create an understanding of the information that is coming to us. So when presented with a set of fairly dynamic variables that come from around us in various different environments, what our brain is constantly doing is creating, I guess the best way to describe it is almost like a neural landscape based on all the different experiences that we've had previously that will help us to navigate through that landscape. Now, of course, the richer our experiences are, the more information, the more experience we've had, the more times we've received that kind of those sorts of information sources from all these different environmental variables, the more we can begin to develop our our mapping, and the more detailed our mapping can become. So that was a really interesting thought to me, because it made me think that again, it comes back to this idea of, if your mapping is based on experiences that are limited in information or have a reduced amount of information, then the experience lacks some richness. So when it comes to developing the detail of the kind of movement map or the developmental process that you're likely to, the inference that you're going to make, the judgment you're going to make, it's going to be limited in its abilities, its ability to solve the problem effectively. So I think of it almost like, going back to the detail, I think of it as if the information within which you perceive and start to make your inferences, then you only end up really with a map that's kind of like a sketch. It's an outline. It's not full of detail. It gives you a way through. It gives you an opportunity to navigate, but it doesn't give you that real detail. And it might also only give you a map with maybe one or two possible routes to get to the objective. Whereas something that's richer in information, that our brain is interpreting and judging and working its way through and understanding and creating a conceptualization of how we might tackle a particular challenge, the richer that information source, then when we play that back in terms of the inferences and the judgments that we're going to make around action, then it's a far richer in terms of detail. There's far more detail in terms of that map, and then potentially as well there are going to be there's a variety of different potential routes depending on the different approaches, the level of variability, and the different ways we do it. And when a problem is presented with a range of variabilities, a range of different levels of variability, what it also presents with it is a range of different solutions. And the likelihood is that when you experience something with a high level of variability, it's never going to be exactly the same twice. And so therefore, the richness of that mapping and the number of inferences and judgments we can make and we can intertwine together and connect together, the better. And then the better the kind of the picture or the map that we can draw for ourselves as we're navigating and creating solutions. And then coming back to the problem earlier on, when we have presented with something that's novel, what we can start to do is we can start to map together all of the different ways in which we might be able to package together all those different inferences and judgments in order to create a map that might not be exact and might not be perfect, but will create enough enough routes for us to move forward, and then that in turn layers on to these movement inferences, and then we have a new set of movement inferences that ever so slightly that are richer. So for me, this concept of a reductionist approach whereby we remove variability, we bring things down to we reduce things down to their core components without a kind of stimulus for action that's brought about by environmental influences and the perception that we have, the perception and the action that we're looking to try and create. We develop a set of movement inferences and movement judgments that just don't have the depth and the richness. And then as a result, when it comes to the necessity to create novel solutions to particular problems, we just don't have the information architecture to be able to navigate through. And the example I was thinking about with this was quite an interesting sort of non-sporting example. Was if you imagine if you were to give somebody kind of a tray with a load of drinks on it, and they've got to navigate their way through a busy a busy bar, and there's lots of people in the way, and those people are moving, and they're moving unpredictably, and there's lots of laughter, and there's so there's lots of information coming in terms of sound and sight and movement and all those sorts of things, and this individual has got to get through that scenario and not spill any of those drinks. Now, they are likely to use a range of movements to do that, and very few of those movements they will have ever encountered before. However, they will have encountered scenarios where they've been in busy areas and they've had to move, and they will have encountered scenarios where they've had to carry drinks before, and when they've had to carry drinks before, there's likely been not as many people in the way, so they have a concept of keeping it level and balance and all those sorts of things. And what they're able to do is they're able to intertwine those two things to create these movement inferences and movement judgments that help them to get themselves through with minimal loss of fluid from the vessels that they are carrying on the tray. And if they were to do it again and again and again and again, they would get increasingly skilled at that. I'm thinking about some of the people who act in a waiting capacity, and how they become increasingly skilled at being able to avoid other people and almost begin to develop like a sixth sense or an intuition based on the way people are going to move. So the reason I was thinking about all of that is that if people were trained to, if those people all they ever did was carry trays of drinks in very, very quiet spaces with nobody there, then they would get very used to doing that. But the minute you put a load of people in there, then they would have a hard time and they're likely to spill quite a few drinks, even though they're able to make some adjustments. But if you put them into that environment from the outset and they carry a lot of trays of drinks with a lot of people around there, their perception of other people's movements and likely movements and their anticipatory capabilities in order to avoid being knocked over or knocking any of the drinks away or whatever it might be, become really heightened, because their inferences are heightened by the level of information and noise coming at them. And then what I imagine they would probably do is, if they start their work where it's not quite as busy and they get used to working at the busy times, then obviously they've got an opportunity to sort of compare and contrast the different movements that they might make, all of which is done implicitly. None of it is done explicitly. None of it is necessarily done through someone saying, oh, watch out for that person, or watch out for this type of person. They're not actually consciously processing any of this. It's not a conscious cognitive process. It is a subconscious or an implicit cognitive process. And that's not to say that they're not using cognition, but they're using cognition in a different sense of the way we normally think about cognition. Normally we think about cognition in an explicit way. Somebody is actively thinking about how they solve the problem. But in this particular context, we would be talking much more about an implicit cognitive process. So that was really interesting, and it just sort of made me really think about, well, the need for us to create environments that have as much richness as possible. It also made me think about the conversation I had with Dr. Edward Collin about decision richness of the environment, and actually estimation of decisions. How decision dense is the session, and if the session has a lot of decisions and a lot of decision density, and therefore there is high levels of engagement as a result, then evaluating sessions in that way, as opposed to evaluating sessions from the perspective of were they happy, or did they perform the task? Performance of the task in the session may not be the outcome we want, because there is so much decision density and there is so much variability and information that the players need time to be able to strip out the irrelevant information, and then in order to be able to narrow in on the information that is pertinent to their action and the successful completion of their action. Which again takes me on to another area of the podcast that Sam was talking with Anil, where he was talking about a concept in the research into consciousness around integrated information theory, IIT. And the idea is that consciousness is essentially, they've got a range of different elements within it. It's a theory by a researcher called Antonio Tognoli that suggests that our awareness, if you like, or our level of consciousness, conscious understanding, conscious processing from a kind of neuroscientific, neurological perspective, is largely driven or linked to our the level of information and the level of integration of that information. So where there is information arriving towards us from the environment, obviously we are going to be conscious of that information. But the more integrated that information is, so the more interconnected that information is, the higher the levels of consciousness we are likely to have. And in my mind, this again linked us to this perception action idea, because the more variability that there is, the higher the level of information and the higher the level of integration of that information. So I think of that a little bit like a crisscross or an interconnection, or like an intersection of a very, very busy intersection on a motorway where there's lots of routes by which the information can flow, or the traffic can flow. So and where there are lots of routes that the traffic can flow, where there's lots of different ways that it can go, and different approaches, this, that, and the other, and there's lots of intertwining and all that sort of stuff, then obviously it's quite challenging in order to navigate. It's difficult to but over a period of time, when you're in that scenario where there's lots of different things to attend to, and as you become more expert, one of the things you do is you begin to understand what are the important aspects, and you begin to you're able to reduce the noise and attend to the appropriate things in order to be able to perform effectively. So I think the traditional thinking on this, the sort of linear methodology or the linear pedagogical approach, would ordinarily say, well, the way to navigate that is to start with very limited information and then build up the information sequentially, so you can make sense of it over a period of time. Now, the assumption with that is that as you begin to layer on the different information sources, and therefore that becomes more integrated and they begin to intertwine, that because you've previously worked on without the other information sources, you've learned to move in a certain way or solve the problem in a certain way, that you don't have to worry about those anymore, so you can attend to the new information that's emerging. The problem is that it doesn't work that way, because when the new information arrives, what it does is it changes the essence of what the previous solution was. It becomes a different thing because it's got this other stuff layered onto it. It's not got that other stuff stripped out, it's that plus, or that multiplied by that other thing. So those information sources begin to strip away. So if any coach out there has ever had a scenario where you've started with something really very simple, a very simple movement pattern, and then you've layered in a increased degree of variability, and the original movement pattern disappears, that's why. Because the information source that's coming is just not relational, it's not relative to this new intertwined information, interconnected information source. It doesn't really bear any resemblance to the previous one, because the previous one was something entirely different. So the reality here, in terms of being able to interact with our environments and interact with these external sources of information, interconnected information sources, is not to reduce the variability unduly, so that it's so stripped back that it doesn't really bear resemblance to the actual movement once it's in context. It's actually to experience that interconnected movement enough times and with enough variability and difference that the actual emergent property, i.e. the solution, the emergent movement pattern, becomes apparent. And the other bits of noise, the performer begins to realise that the other elements of noise are irrelevant. There are just certain important factors that need to be attended to in order to be able to perform effectively, and they begin to filter out the noise themselves. And therefore, they become much more accustomed to identifying and filtering information, in this integrated information, in such a way that they're able to perceive their environment in much clearer sense, and they have a much heightened degree of consciousness over the action, because they're almost able to avoid being distracted by that sort of additional noise or that additional chatter, if you like. And really, really high-level elite performers, one of the things that characterises them is their ability to navigate all this other noise, and just they seem to have more time than others. And that's just because they have a real clarity. Clive Woodward used to talk about thinking correctly under pressure, and the only way that could happen was to have enough exposure to thinking correctly under pressure in order to be able to think correctly under pressure. So it's not something that you can do if you're trying to build up to it without any pressure. It will just disappear. It will break down. So the previous movement pattern stuff just almost becomes a bit redundant. Now, that's not to say that there might not be there might not be things that could be rehearsed or elements that could be tried and tested, but it's as a result of something emerging to a performer that they begin to recognise, actually, through this process of stripping away the noise, that actually there's something here that I need to become more proficient at, and I'm going to develop it. And one of the things I was thinking about is that when the problem becomes apparent to a performer because of the context in which they discovered the problem, so all this noise, everything else, and there's something here that I need to solve, there's a problem I need to solve. When it becomes apparent, and they then go away and they want to then reduce the noise a little bit in order to be able to just attend to something without that noise being in the way, they do it in a different way. They're going to do it with a mental map or a mental picture of where the problem emerged from. So if you like, they'll have a simulation running through their mind when they are practicing outside of that kind of realm with a high level of variability. They are challenging themselves with if you like, a running program in the background that retains that sort of cognitive connection with the problem as it was predefined. So the picture in their mind is of them solving the problem in the context. They are thinking about how they solve the problem, and they have pictures running through their brains or through their minds that simulate the likely context in which they originally discovered that problem. And that makes the practice environment, that kind of individual practice environment, far more rich, because it's played against a simulated contextual backdrop. Whereas if you flip it the other way around and you are learning an isolated technique on the basis that a coach, a more knowledgeable individual who understands the way techniques are applied and understands what techniques are important for successful performance within sport, because they have previous knowledge of that, and they try to teach somebody that that movement pattern in isolation of the contextual problem that has emerged, then that individual doesn't have that mental map in which to unravel or in which to practice against. So they're not able to contextualize the learning. Now, some coaches are kind of fairly smart, and they will they will create performance challenges, or they will create performance metaphors as a means by which to help the individual to reframe their problem, or to reframe the problem and make it more realistic. And I'm thinking about Kendall McQuaid using a golf club with a hammer on the end as a way of framing a problem around how I would grip and hold a golf club in order to perform a certain action. And that metaphor actually reframed the problem in such a way that it made it very easy for me to make what was a fairly profound technical change that was then helpful to me in performing a movement action in golf. And that was by essentially framing the problem in a certain way to say, the problem you're trying to solve is not the problem you think you're trying to solve. You think you're trying to solve this problem. But if I give you a different implement to use, so you could use it as a metaphor, you would solve the problem in a different way. And then by reframing that problem, that gave me that kind of visual connection with the task at hand and changed the way I was trying to achieve the objective quite fundamentally, and with some significant performance outcomes. Now, the powerful nature of this is that by designing sessions or activities within sessions, more accurately, that have as much of the attendant information, or at least enough of the attendant information that bears some approximation to the level of information, integrated information, that is likely to emerge through a relationship, the way the person is going to interact with their experience within a context, a sporting context. What we're giving then people is, perhaps a far richer palette of colour and more potential to use different sort of approaches to draw their pictures, to create their inferences, to create those mental influences. And those inferences we can layer and layer and layer and layer and layer and layer. And the richer in which we experience those, the more technicolor that our experience of the world is, the better chance we have of creating that representation in the experience we have. And the interesting thing about this particular research as well is that our processes, our visual processes, are very different from our perceptive or our proprioceptive processes. The way our brain is processing and making sense of how we sense the world from a proprioceptive, a feeling, touching perspective, connected with what's going on within our visual context, is where that integrated information comes from. If all we did was observe and then replicate what we observe, without the need to act in three-dimensional space, it would be very different. Which is one of the reasons why, when people use the argument that in order to learn to spell, you first need to learn what letters are and the sounds that letters make, in order to then spell, and all those sorts of things. Actually, that process might work in a kind of visual and auditory sense. So, if I'm learning to spell or learning to read, I've got to learn to recognise what a word is. I've got to recognise what a letter is, and then recognise what combinations of letters mean, and what then, when there's a load of combinations together, then that makes certain words, you combine them together and you build them into their component parts. Certainly my son, who struggles with dyslexia, found that very, very difficult. Struggles to understand and make connections between the way letters are formed and the sounds that they should make. Whereas if you look at it the other way around, if it was also about sensing and perceiving, if we're talking about that, so that's a very different thing, because that's a largely visual and to a certain extent auditory process, which our brain processes in a certain way. Now, which is one of the reasons that with dyslexics, they look into visual processing, they look into things like working memory, because they are trying to work out if people have that capacity to make a visual process and process it in working memory with enough time in order to be able to then read fluently. My son reads quite slowly, and it's largely because it's taking him longer to process visually and also for his working memory to make that happen. Albeit his working memory seems to be pretty good. But when it comes to things like when it comes to reading, when it comes to things like spatial awareness and understanding where things should go and how they should fit together and how they clump together, when it comes to building things, creating things, doing things using an implement of any kind, like drawing and these sorts of things, and how things connect together, he's far more fluid, far more he's far more intuitive with making connections with what he sees and what he feels using an implement or using solving a problem in that way. And he's far more in touch with that kind of proprioceptive processing or kinesthetic processing, and it's quite interesting to see how that works. So it's clear to me that there are definitely disconnections. Now for me, I think the solution for us as coaches is not necessarily to strip away variability, but actually to help athletes to understand what to attend to. And this is where our feedback can come in, because what we can do is we can ask questions and pose challenges that have a particular problem that needs to be solved, and help them to begin to understand what the elements of variability they don't need to attend to in order to find the appropriate or a range of appropriate movement solutions. And over a period of time, implicitly, they begin to do that. And the skill of the constraint, using different constraints, can make that more or less apparent to them. So we can guide them towards different courses of action by manipulating constraints in such a way so as to either take away some elements of variability and begin to make, drop them some clues about what might be the thing to attend to, or we can just begin to discuss with them or ask questions that slowly but surely, through almost like a process of elimination, help them to understand that there are some things that they aren't as relevant to them in helping them to solve this problem, and then they begin to go through a process where they're engaged in taking away the different elements that aren't really going to help them with the problem solving process. So it was just a really interesting stimulation from as I was driving along listening to a podcast that percolated some thoughts into my mind, and these are the things I'm now exploring more relevantly. Tomorrow I'm giving a talk down at the Olympic Park to a load of coaches who've been working there around feedback, and I'll be using some of this discussion with them around how they can use external feedback and athletes' internal feedback and tune the athletes into their internal feedback, so that the athlete becomes more aware of the things that they need to attend to, so that they can build the kind of the right information architecture to help them navigate through a particular problem that they're trying to solve. So that's going to be an interesting day tomorrow. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this carcast audio ramble. I'm hoping it's going to be of value to you. I'm also the day after tomorrow I'm going to be flying off to Disney World, so by the time you hear this podcast I am likely to be on a roller coaster with some young people, or possibly with Mickey Mouse, or possibly trying to avoid getting into the Harry Potter world if I can help it, and that will obviously have an enormous amount of integrated information, the Disney World experience. So anyway, I'll report back when I see you next. In the meantime, as always, have an amazing time with your coaching, and have a little go at helping young people to navigate through this integrated information, and seeing if you can sort of tap them into their perceptual awareness of the things they need to attend to and they don't need to attend to. As always, always grateful for your support, and another intrepid supporter came on through the Patreon and pledged their support, and it is actually one of the very early guests on the podcast, and I'm extremely grateful for her support. Joey Peters from Gameplay Learn has come on as a Patreon supporter. Joey, you're awesome. I love what you do, and I see it as a very high praise that you're prepared to become a supporter of the podcast, and more power to you. thank you very much, and thank you to all the other supporters. As always, your support is gratefully received and genuinely helping to keep the light on at the Talent Equation. In the meantime, all the best, and see you again soon.